Turning to Heather Thompson's remarkably wide-ranging essay, which I had the privilege of reading all of, I mean that, it makes one truly hungry to read her book on Attica. It has long been evident, especially to those of us who experienced adolescence in New York City in the early 70s, that the willful exclusion of the Attica Rebellion from traditional 60s histories was an egregious example of the good 60s, bad 60s approach, in which the latter, badness, was reduced to the raging days of some white student radicals and the pernicious rise of that catch-all straw man identity politics. Her work contributes to a fundamental recuperation of the 1968-1975 period as one in which, while revolution was not, in hindsight, a realistic option, it was certainly in the air, as my friend Max Albaum documents in his excellent book on the new communist movement of that title. The system-wide organizing by inmates, predominantly Black and Latino, will reorganize our understanding of the contours of resistance, solidarity, and state repression in Nixon's America, and we need more. We need a book on the movement to free Angela Davis, through which the Communist Party, led by Charlene Mitchell, a Black power figure if ever there was one, reestablished itself in Black communities, and the related movement to free Ben Chavis and the Wilmington prisoners. We will want to know what happened in Southern prisons as their 19th century regimes were finally exposed, the mass graves dug up, that pervasive habits of torture and casual murder exposed through federal suits. We need scholarship to unpack the relationships, and you may be doing this, between the different prison networks of the Nation of Islam and the adherents of the Black Panther Party and George Jackson. We will want to know the extent to which white prisoners other than jailed leftists like Sam Melville joined in the struggles of Black and Latino inmates. And conversely, we definitely want to know how the rise of violent white supremacist gangs was fostered or tolerated by prison authorities as a counterforce to politicized prisoners of color. Death squads, in other words. Having posed these questions, the most striking contribution in Heather's paper is the argument that civil rights in the putatively traditional or classic or heroic, those words we use, mode of litigation and the elaboration of binding judicial precedents proceeded through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and maybe even now, to the activism of self-educated prison lawyers. This must confound all our ideas of absolute declension, and indeed confirms my own tentative hypothesis that a new democratic order, I quote, arrived in the US after the 60s despite the conquest of significant state power by the energized, indeed Bolshevik New Right. What better evidence for the expansion of democracy than the stubborn insistence by poor men and women, Black, Latino, and white, incarcerated so often for drug-related crimes, that they had rights which they would and could defend. Now, I do not mean to fly off into a Pollyannish reverie that denies the facts of mass imprisonment of Black men from the 70s on, sweeping over time millions out of urban centers deep into isolated white rural territory like that where I grew up, Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. This seems to be a core social fact of late 20th century America. One part, I think, of a sweeping assault on democratic rights, including systematic efforts by Republicans to suppress the new Black vote and stigmatize and criminalize Black elected officials, as traced by Derek Musgrove in a brilliant dissertation at NYU. So we must not romanticize resistance in the prisons or confuse a prisoner filing a suit with the fact that in most societies that person had never been in prison in the first place or not for very long. So I'm going to conclude with some questions for Heather. First, if there is, and certainly appears, it sounds as if there is, a civil rights culture inside the prisons, to what extent has it been sustained by external institutions, such as the pro bono work done even now by leading law firms, that sort of archaic residue of public service? Decades of litigation by prisoners suggest an institutionalized activism via established channels, and I want to know more about that. But I admit this is a naive question. I have no idea whether the NAACP LDF or MALDEF, Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, or the Puerto Rican Congress for Civil Rights, for example, have attorneys devoted to prisoners' rights or in some way serve as resources for this activism. But I want to know. Second, what have prisoners nationwide won since Attica? Clearly, they have more rights. They file more suits. But can we discern long-term changes in treatment, including the levels, the form and level and intensity of sanctioned violence or access to resources? and I'm saying this versus the more familiar narrative that I'm sure we all know about mandatory minimums, 3 strikes, and supermaxes, which is what has been on my mind. In other words, what more is there to demonstrate, and I'm sure there is, the consequences, the results, successes, victories of this civil rights activism that you point us to? And in that vein, are there meaningful distinctions that you would make, or that other scholars will make, by state or region, different prison systems, or between the tiers of city, county, state, and federal prisons? Is there a particular area where it's possible to gain more rights, where this is especially effective? My last question is, if it's a civil rights culture, how do the various types of prisoners, and we have many cross-cutting tiers here, black, white, Latino, which is not Latino is sort of a catch-all category, but also the victims of Rockefeller drug laws and all the other, sweep the streets laws, versus the long-term professionals, right? Finally, the remaining political prisoners, and what you've suggested may be new tiers of political prisoners, even if convicted under drug laws. How do all of these relate to each other in terms of maintaining and extending and complexifying the civil rights culture? Who leads? Well, that's my last question. Thank you.